Cosa dici? C'è sta uno che ci sta a sparare. Good evening, everybody, and thanks again for coming here, especially under this most inclement weather. Before we start, and I'd like to say a couple of things. The first thing is that what you heard in the past 2 days and what we will hear today is the product of original research in archives. This is very important because this is what the Medici Archive Project does. That is, its main focus is to focus on primary sources. And the second thing is that a portion of what you've seen in the past 2 days and what we'll see today will be featured in an exhibition that will take place on September 2023 at Palazzo Pitti. So this is sort of a preview, you know, a small taste of what we are about to produce as in terms of an exhibition. Today we'll be speaking about what we think is an extraordinary discovery, and before we do this, I will give you another sort of introduction, another contextualization on Cosimo III. And in general, it is, I should say that in terms of the research on the Medici, Cosimo III is probably the one who has, who's been, ignored, especially in comparison to the previous Medici, especially in comparison to the first Duke, Cosimo I. But I think that it's important to know that one aspect that distinguished the Medici, overall, I think, was their patronage and involvement in scientific endeavors. Each member of this dynasty, especially when we look at the Grand Ducal period, so from 1537 to 1743, approached this interest from different perspective. I'm showing you one of these pre-Raphaelite paintings, done in the 19th century of I think it's Galileo demonstrates the laws of gravity to Don Giovanni de' Medici, an event that probably never happened, like most of these historical pictures, like Savonarola at the deathbed of Lorenzo the Magnificent, or Perugino teaching young Raphael how to paint. But it's interesting to show this because it gives you the idea of how important the sciences or the natural sciences were at the time of the Medici. So I think the first person, the first Duke, that really had a keen interest in scientific endeavors was Cosimo I. And Cosimo had a real passion for the medical sciences. His collection of medical treatises and books on pharmacology, as well as his attendance, his physical attendance at anatomical dissections, is very well documented in the Medici archives. Recently, we have learned that his scientific interests were not just limited to medicine, but also to botany, to agronomy, to hydraulics, to geography, astronomy, mineralogy. He was omnivorous. He was the exact opposite of Cosimo III in many ways. He was the ultimate alpha person. Also, not as alpha as his father was Francesco. Francesco is very well known for his for his interest in alchemy and chemistry, along with his mistress and then later wife and later Grand Duchess, Bianca Cappello. They spent significant time in the studiolo at Palazzo Vecchio or in the laboratories in the various Medici villas. He too, however, was interested in botany, and his correspondence about exotic plants and animals with the Bolognese naturalist Ulisse Aldrovandi, and you see a drawing from him in the background, is also recorded in the Medici archives. Francesco's brother, Grand Duke Ferdinando, he was more interested in mathematics and technology, and remember that Ferdinando is the one who appointed Galileo at the University of Pisa in 1589. His son, Cosimo II, interested in astronomy and geography, and Cosimo II's son, Ferdinando II, which we've talked about a lot in the past 2 days, was into technology and especially scientific instruments of various kinds. On the whole, the Medici, were very curious about the world around them and about the universe above them. And unlike other European states, for many reasons, of course, they had practically no colonial ambition. I mean, there's only one exception, which is an expedition in the Amazon River in 1608, which was promoted by Ferdinand I and led by the English corsair Robert Thornton. However, this project was scrapped by his son Cosimo II, who was a lot more interested in the trade business with the Levant and with Northern Africa. The Medici, as I said, were very curious. They would learn about distant lands through handwritten newsletters. They're called avvisi. They're basically the newspapers of the 16th and 17th century, which they purchased and read and collected and archived. And this information in these sort of Renaissance / early modern newspapers would enhance the already rich body of news that arrived in Florence on a daily basis from Medici ambassadors and agents and informants. We were really posted all over Europe, and of course through merchants, including Jewish ones, as we know from the Medici archives. Just to give you an idea of what we're working with, today we call the Medici del Principato, that is the archive of the Medici from the Grand Ducal period, comprises something like 4 to maybe 7 million letters. Here you have an image of the archive, the collection of the Medici Archive, when it used to be at the Uffizi, and it really deals with 200 years of history. The interesting thing about this archive that really no one knows is that it really is not an archive about Florence per se or Tuscany, but it's really a global archive, precisely because of the avvisi or newsletters that I was talking about, precisely because a lot of letters came from foreign diplomats and regents, and most importantly, because the great majority of these letters came from ambassadors and agents which were posted all over Europe. And here you have a list of from Rome to Milan to Constantinople, and so bear in mind that, in terms of the economy of this archive, so to speak, for every letter that was sent by the Medici to the world, 30 came in. So as you can see, it's much more a global archive than it is a Florentine archive. But the Medici were interested, in the world around them also because they had a vast collection of maps and globes, that they allowed them to pinpoint the exact locations of what they read about in these newspapers and in the ambassadorial reports. Also, bear in mind that their patronage of cartographers and geographers was quite notable, as it can be evinced, for instance, from the Sala della Guardaroba or the Sala delle Carte Geografiche at Palazzo Vecchio, which was constructed and put together by Ignazio Danti. Also, the Medici had an impressive collection of manuscript and printed text, which served as a compass to navigate the kind of protean and dynamic world or the dynamic universe that was sort of rapidly unfolding outside of Florence. So aside from aside from the classics, so books in Greek and in Latin, the inventories of the Medici libraries indicate a great number of scientific and medical treatises. And by the way, this library is the collection of the Medici is what makes up the Biblioteca Nazionale in Florence as well as the Laurenziana. So. They also reconstructed these lands virtually, so to speak, through a variety of objects, exotica and naturalia, artificialia, which they stored in the many cabinet of curiosities or armoires that they had in both in the palazzi and in the villas. Bear in mind that these objects were either gifts or were purchased through their vast network of merchants and dealers, as for instance, Jacobillo Nunes, Jacobillo Ebreo, the Portuguese Sephardi Jewish merchant that was mentioned during our first evening and that Gabriele has studied in depth. Finally, and perhaps more importantly for this lesson, for this talk, the Medici spent much effort and many funds, important funds, in recreating sort of the fruits and plants of the world through or thanks to their botanical gardens, which were located in Pisa, in Florence, and in many of their villas. So as you can see, they didn't leave Florence in order to see the world in many ways, but in a sense, the world came to them without doing any damage, as perhaps other countries have done in other nations in the early modern period. The study of plants, and we go back to Cosimo III, Cosimo III, and fruits, has been a favorite pastime of the Medici Grand Dukes, especially of Cosimo III. During the course of more than half a century, because he ruled for 50 years more, Cosimo III patronized, corresponded, and even collaborated with the sort of the cutting-edge naturalists, botanists, geologists, and agronomists of the time. And I here include three of the most famous ones, the Danish Nicolò Steno, Francesco Redi, which we discussed yesterday, and Michelangelo Tilli. And we can see their works represented in a very symbolic way underneath them. Remember that Cosimo did his fantastic European tour, and as I mentioned, mostly to escape from his mother and his wife, and probably also his father. And when he was still a prince, his interest was omnivorous. When he was traveling in Europe, his interest was literally omnivorous. But two things attracted him the most. One was relics, religious relics. Remember, he had a dual, he had a schizophrenic side. He was very religious and very scientific at the same time. So religious relics were something that he was very interested in, and it appeased his pious and personal dimension. But also he was very interested in bizarre plants and exotic flowers and deformed fruits. This is something that fascinated him. And maybe he saw, the two things, the religiousness and the science, should be seen together. Maybe, some scholars have sort of claimed that, maybe he saw his religion, his religiosity through nature, in a way which was, and through the variety of nature. During his extended journeys in European cities, as I mentioned, he met with naturalists, with apothecaries, with botanists. As I said, his curiosity was literally omnivorous. He visited gardens and naturalia museums and pharmacies and parks and flower markets, and he loved orange and lemon groves. In England, he was utterly mesmerized by the landscape, the country houses and the agricultural land, and especially by the way the English experienced nature. In Amsterdam, he was buying books everywhere. He purchased books on medical remedies, and especially medical remedies dealing with the New World and in East Asia. And he also bought a still life by Jan Davids de Hem, however you pronounce his name, which is now today at the Uffizi. In France, he loved the gardens. He loved hydraulics. He was mesmerized by the hydraulics, the way the French did their gardens. It's something, especially how they use water to refresh their gardens. It's something that he really wanted to bring back to Florence. And also, whenever he had a chance, he would climb on the highest vantage point, right, or hill, a tower, and scout the horizon with the telescope. This is an image from his trip to Spain, to Santiago de Compostela, which is sort of like a pilgrimage. And here he is. He traveled with a priest, with a doctor, with a secretary, and with someone who drew, everywhere he had been and everywhere he was going. And this is the group, the entourage of Cosimo III approaching Santiago. And for every city, he asked the artist to draw the landscape and the cityscape together, as if nature was almost united with the urban fabric, and vice versa. Of course, his interest in horticulture was fomented by his father Ferdinand, and again, that probably contrasted or not, we don't know, the very severe religious education that he received from his mother, Vittoria della Rovere. And let's not forget that during Cosimo's childhood, Florence had become a center for scientific experimentation thanks to the Accademia del Cimento, which was founded by Ferdinand II, his father, and by his brother, Cardinal Leopoldo, And this became a hub for French, English, and German naturalists. So at that point, Florence, before Cosimo, was still a kind of a center for scientific experimentation. Once Cosimo III became Grand Duke, he sponsored publications of pharmacological remedies, scientific treatises, recipe books, including the new edition of the Ricettario Fiorentino, which was the official sort of pharmacopoeia made to regulate the production of medicaments by apothecaries in Tuscany, and also was continuously updated over the course of the 16th and 17th century, reflecting in many ways the changes in medical theory and in medical practice. And of course, Cosimo III sponsored a great number of university positions dealing with botany and agronomy. He also did something strange in many ways. It goes back to the idea of curiosity. He sponsored scientific expeditions, not many, but a few, which would record and bring back to Florence New World and Asian and African plants and fruits, potatoes, pineapple, ginseng, tomatoes, And sometimes these were planted in the gardens at the University of Pisa. Also, this passion for plants and fruits, and animals, by the way, I should add, was of course reflected in the collection of pictorial representations of plants, fruits, and animals, right? Again, this is not something exclusive to Cosimo III, but it was a widespread interest among the Medici Grand Dukes and Grand Duchesses and princes since the 16th century and perhaps even earlier. Today, we get a good sense of this collection of still lives at the Museo della Natura Morta, which opened in 2007, and it's located at the Villa of Poggia Caiano, just outside of Florence, between Florence and Prato, right? And the bulk of this Still Lives Museum, which comprises something like 350 works, was really put together in the early 17th century. However, it reached really the highest point with Cosimo III and his son Ferdinand, il Gran Principe Ferdinando, the one that he thought would be the heir but died prematurely. Originally, these still lives were used to decorate the many Medici palaces and villas and hunting lodges which were scattered all over Tuscany, By the way, Cosimo III did not only purchase these pictures, not just Italian, but also Dutch and Flemish, but he also commissioned them to be done from scratch, ex novo. So the painter that, in a sense, represented or incarnated Cosimo's taste for portraits of nature was, of course, Bartolomeo Bimbi, whose works are featured copiously throughout this museum. Bimbi, in a sense, was able to integrate Cosimo's interest for scientific inquiry with his love for Baroque still lives, and these pictures often served as artistic records of the variety of fruits and plants that were cultivated in the botanical gardens in the Medici Villa. Also, remember yesterday I mentioned how, 2 days ago I mentioned how Cosimo really focused a lot of his interest and a lot of his efforts in making Tuscany sort of the breadbasket of Italy, at least, investing a lot in agronomy and especially wheat and wine. The one thing, of course, that is featured prominently in this collection and in Bimbi's Catalogue raisonné is the paintings of flowers, and however, if you look at them carefully, they're never really repetitive or mechanical. There's a sort of spontaneity and freshness to these works, which most of the time were painted dal vivo, that are painted, with the actual flower in front of him. Bartolomeo Bimbi also produced sort of large-scale canvases, sort of documenting the extraordinary variety of fruits that were cultivated in the gardens, especially the villa called Villa Topaia. And at the same time, also, the freshly killed game or the zoological or sort of the animal subjects that, were displayed, the catch, the game that was displayed live at another villa called the Villa Ambroggiana. Cosimo, as I mentioned yesterday, because he invested so much in wine, implanted sort of a great variety of grapes. And many of these grapes are celebrated in a very scientific way in Bimbi's pictures. And of course, in the great sort of work of poetry written by his doctor Francesco Redi, Bacco in Toscana, as I mentioned yesterday too. As you can see, a lot of these pictures represent or feature figs and oranges that were produced in the villas, and sometimes there's a cartouche that one can see at the bottom of the picture, that allows the viewer to identify each variety of that fruit, each variety of fig, and on the one hand, and each variety of an orange on the other. Another thing that Bimbi did, which is interesting, which again goes back to Cosimo's passion for bizarre and deformed fruits, was again he recorded the most extraordinary bizarre and deformed fruits, just as this humongous truffle that you see on the side and this bizarre sort of cauliflower head on the other side. Also, anything that was sort of weird and strange and abnormal, he would paint. Here you have this, again, very large head of cauliflower, and also this very sensual anthropomorphic, I think is a rapa. I'm not quite sure what it is in English. It's I can't remember, think of the word rapa in English, I'm sorry. But it's that thing that looks like a human being sitting on a couch. So another thing that he recorded was going back to that bizarreness and monstrous, were sort of, calves with two heads, sheep with two heads. There's a lot of that. That in a sense, he interests him in the way nature manifests itself in the most unique way, in the most extraordinary way. Here you have another picture of the game, which is a deer in this case, and birds that were just been hunted. Cosimo III was not hardly a hunter. Ferdinand, his son, liked to sing. That's what he did. He liked music. So hunting was not really part of his deal. But Giangastone, the other son, loved hunting and loved horseback riding, just as his great-great-great-grandfather Cosimo I liked to do. Another thing which was recorded frequently were fish. In this case, Bimbi is recording a large fish, because the cartouche says, this is actually a very, very large fish. Don't ask me what fish it is, but I assume it's a fish, a freshwater fish. And you can see him sort of, gasping its last breath, and, unfortunately, you have no idea of how big it is, because there's no way of having a meter next to it to figure that out. However, that's something that Bimbi did as well. The depiction of fish, especially not with Cosimo III, but with his son Ferdinando, which is a passion that, for still lives that, both father and son shared, was also very much present in the collection of the Medici. Here we have three paintings by artists I don't think you know, Felicio Boselli, Giacomo Fardella di Calvello, and Onofrio Loff, one from Piacenza and two from the south, one from Naples. And here you again, you get the sense of this idea of the catch of the day, and that sort of, idealization of fish. Fish are very hard to paint. I'm not a painter, but the most, because of the way the light reflects and the way the scales, have a effect with light, they are very, very hard to paint. Of course, the artist that was represented the most, the pioneer artist of still lives with fish, was this painter called Giuseppe Recco. Giuseppe Recco was a Neapolitan, and the Neapolitans were the ones who really pursued the still lives of fish. Of course, they're next to the ocean. They are the ones who really, who really sort of, especially Giuseppe Recco made a career in depicting fish. He later went to Spain and became sort of, the portrait, fish portrait artist of the court of Spain. And he is, someone that, and again, in this case, you see him in this very kind of a Jesque way, in this hard chiaroscuro, and his incredible sort of, naturalism and realism, not naturalism, realism, and also displaying his virtuoso picture. Why am I showing you fish? Yeah? You're expecting something else, and this is what you're expecting. This is Janostilo. This is Janostilo, and in a second, Gabriele will talk about Janostilo, who is the Jewish painter that we discovered at the Medici Archive Project. He obviously is someone who was representing fish in a very, very brutal way, just like Recco, in this very pronounced chiaroscuro, and he's especially good in depicting the glimmer of the scales and the irregular blotches of red, and you can sort of hardly see, a cornucopia in the background and a basket. This picture was taken by us, by the way, with a camera, so because it's not even recorded in much of their archives, and here's another picture of Janostilo, still fish, and it's interesting to see. These are mostly ocean fish. I think these, I'm not quite sure. No, these are ocean fish, and you can see them here. Again, with these spotlights, which sort of accentuate the curves and the sinuosity, and at the same time, he creates sort of a little drama or a little wit, by representing this crab, perhaps the only survival of the catch of the day, sort of in an oddly anthropomorphic manner, almost looking at us, staring at us from below, this mountain of fish. And here is another painting by Jona. Of course, as you can see, we went to the deposits, went to the storage room at Poggio a Caiano, and we found them in this state. This picture here obviously needs to be restored. Another picture of fish. And here again, these are not ocean fish. These are lake or river fish, freshwater fish. And, and you can see sort of a large, I think it's a pike, that takes the center scene, and again, two fishes on the side grasping for air, and also the crayfish, which were very, very copious in the rivers of Tuscany. So this is Janostilo, the painter who, was born and who lived in the ghetto, the Jewish painter. And only showing you a portion of this, because of course we found many more pictures, and of course we would like to study them first before we present them to you. But this is a preview of Jona. As you can see, and if I'm going to ask you, and I might go around and ask you how many Jewish painters from the Renaissance and the early modern period do you know in Italy, maybe you know them. We don't. We know a couple, but we can hardly call them painters, I think. Yeah. Exactly. So Janostilo is the part of this last lecture. And I took a very odd trajectory. I took the scientific trajectory to show you that the Janostilo was part of a collection pattern, from Cosimo III, that mostly came from was born from the scientific side. Obviously had, a very strong artistic component, but it actually, came from that trajectory, from that line of collecting, from that line of pattern of collecting. Thank you. And here is Gabriele, which will talk about Jona, the person.
Working? Oh, great. Fantastic. Thanks again for coming tonight for this stormy weather. It's fantastic to see you even more than yesterday, so it's really a pleasure for me. And let me go into the story in medias res. I want to tell you not only why we discovered this painter, okay, but why is he such an important figure today. As a general context, in Italy at least, Jewish painters are said to become, Jews are said to become painters only in the 19th century, in coincidence or as a consequence of emancipation. So with the destruction of the ghettos, and once the Jews were fully righted in Italy, becoming citizens, they became painters. A lot of historians said, okay, Jews before emancipation didn't want to be painters because iconic culture is not part of Jewish culture, because using images is considered something that, questionable in Jewish culture. Theoretically, it's true. We don't like, psalim, icons to look at, to gaze at, and to pray, that's for sure. But this idea that the Jews didn't want to be painters because they hate iconic culture, it's something that doesn't make really sense. And it didn't make sense to me, and doesn't make sense to me still. Okay, in Italy we have Moise Bianchi, who was a decent painter, quite important, in the 19th century, and nothing before it. In the Renaissance, there seems to be no one joining the painting industry. But there was someone in Italy joining or becoming a professional musician in the 16th century. Maybe Salomon Rossi and people in Venice imitating the music of the churches in the Ghetto and then importing these external elements and turning them into Jewish elements, okay? So why not painting? Well, there were a lot of reasons why the Jews didn't want or couldn't be painters. Because in order to be a painter, we had to become a member of an academia or a confraternity. And since these confraternities, all the professional confraternities, were also religiously connotated, they had to follow rituals, okay? Sort of, religious rituals and spiritual experiences together. Jews weren't allowed to be, not allowed to be part of these confraternities, these guilds, which is a good reason to know why, a good hypothesis to know why they were not painters. So the general content of this discovery is our organization of the exhibition at the Pitti Palace about the Jews and the Medici. We were working on this exhibition with a lot of interns and people, doing survey of all major museums, art museums around the world, North America, South America, Europe, Israel, and so on. The result of our search, a survey that took like a year. So we have been working a lot on museum catalogs and also auctions, is that there was nothing produced by the Jews decently speaking in terms of art before the 19th century. So there seems to be that we have to stick to the idea, to the historiographical vulgate that the Jews did not exist as painters before the 19th century. Until what? Until something happened. In our research, as you can imagine, there is a central level of serendipity, okay, what we call in Italian caso, okay? It doesn't depend on our ability to look for the right sources, but it is determined by the fact that when you look for a source in an archive, and then you open a volume consisting of 1,000 folios, well, you find the letter, you find the document that you are looking for, but then some pages before or after, in the same volume or next to the volume, there seems to be something interesting. It happened to me even more interesting than what you were hunting for. What happened? In November 2021, one of my colleagues, Sheila Barker, who is the director of the Women Artists Program at the Medici Archive Project, suggested me to look for a person, the name of Jona Osilio. She basically sent me a text, a WhatsApp message saying, I found a list of works in the register of the Grand Dukes. And some of these works are attributed to someone called Jona Osilio. We don't know anything about him. Why don't you try to look for more sources, more information about him? Okay, I tried, And we tried to do, general survey, once again, looking for the most important sources, historiographical sources. So the most important was this text written in 1817 by the chief rabbi of Florence, gli ebrei a Firenze during the Renaissance, so the Jews in Florence during the Renaissance, but he covered before the Renaissance, a bit after the Renaissance. And he said that in a previous article published like 10 years before, in 1907, he mentioned that he had found a source, a manuscript source, in the National Library in Florence, with a sketch, a biographical sketch of this artist. No more than that, just a few lines and a footnote. I went to the article, I saw what it was writing about this artist, and he said, I found this source, I will quote some of the passages, most important passages that I found in this source, and he was summarizing the contents. The summary was really interesting. Even, I was attracted by these strange characters appearing from these texts. Which text? The text was written by an artist, Giovanni Camillo Sagrestani. He was also a writer who wrote considerably important series of biography of fellow artists and painters of his time, so contemporaries, okay, including the life of one of his friends, Jona Osilio. Now, I know that I should have translated these into English, sorry about that, but for the next time, you will have a decent translation. For the time being, what I want to focus to underline is what Sagrestani reported about Jona Osilio was something that was contemporary to Sagrestani and Osilio too. They were two friends, okay? They were living at the same time, and what he was reporting in this short text was something that he heard from the guy he was writing about. And the story is simple. Let me summarize the story, the life of Jona Osilio. Jona Osilio was born in the Ghetto of Florence. We don't know exactly when. I suppose around 1650, something like that, 1640. I don't know exactly when. By the age of 36, he became interested in painting. As an inhabitant of the Ghetto, he was not allowed to be part of the guilds, of the professional guilds, to become a professional painter. So what he did, he bought some paintings produced by one of the most important painters of the time, Salvatorosa, trying to make copies. He was basically a self-taught artist. And he became so good that the copies were not detectable from the originals. According to Sagrestani, his copies were perfect. So he was self-teaching, basically, in a very unusual way, because I'm not an expert on art history, but I don't think that the painters at the time were basically self-teaching by buying valuable works produced by other artists, like buying today Andy Warhol in order to be an Andy Warhol artist. You can't do that today, apart from the prices. But that's, I think it's quite obvious that, he has to bypass this ban of being unable to be part of a confraternity or a guild. So the only way to learn painting was to copy other works instead of being part of a workshop in Florence or be part of a bottega with other artists guiding him stylistically and technically. Okay, this is really important. So he became a good painter. He was commissioned some works mostly by noble people living in Florence. So it seems to me that indirectly this information is relevant. If noble families were buying paintings from Jona, it meant that the quality of his works was quite good. So I don't think that aristocrats in Florence were buying works just for fun or just for the piety of someone living in the ghetto. And where was he working at the time? In this map produced by Bonsignori in 1584, so a century before our story, more or less, you have the red square that is the ghetto. And the green square, the green, rectangle, whatever, something like that, is the Corte dei Donati. It's a place with a building belonging to the Donati family where there was a workshop, an art workshop, led by Onorio Marinari, a very important artist of his time, and locally at least. I didn't know him before, but because I'm ignorant. But I understood that Marinari was quite a figure in Florence. So Jona wasn't part of the workshop officially, but he was working next to these workshops. I mean, knowing Italy, I think he was admitted, unofficially in the workshop. But as a Jew, he couldn't be registered as part of the workshop. I have no idea, but I think that there's something in between. Official position and official position. But then we have the very spicy, interesting story. Because while he was living in the ghetto, presumably in the day, and then joining the workshop, and he was allowed to do as a Jew, okay, then he started becoming familiar with people living at the Corte dei Donati, including who is described as a beautiful, young, rich widow. And he fell in love, basically, with a widow, until, basically, they started having a relationship. As we saw, 2 days ago, yesterday, I don't remember exactly, yesterday, Judeo-Christian connections were not officially allowed, okay? That was against the canon laws. Having a personal connection with a Jew and a Christian was prohibited by law and by the church too. But then what happened? This relationship continued until someone whom we don't know the name of this guy, pretending to be a friar, tried to kill Jona, to stab him several times, even planned to behead him and then to bury the body at the Corte dei Donati. Maybe he was a member of the family, the Donati family, who wanted to prevent an indecent, union between a Jew and a Christian or something, avoid a scandal to the family. We don't know exactly. And also Sagrestani, who is writing this sketch, said, I won't be reporting on the spicy details for the sake of their name and dignity. It's a pity for us. We wanted to know more about the scandal, whether there were children, was he converted to Christianity eventually because he loved the lady and the lady couldn't convert to Judaism. We don't know. But what is really the point? Is that there seems to be a close connection, personal connection between Jona, the external places around the ghetto, the workshop of Marinari, okay, and the lady. So at the end of the story and the end of this sketch, Sagrestani said, okay, I won't tell you more, but I can tell you they were happy together after the scandal of the fake priest. Interesting to know. But then we found another source, in this case, Baldinucci, who's also a writer who wrote The Life of Artists, confirming, I don't want to go into detail, in the life of Antonio Giusti, another painter of the time, he said, Antonio Giusti and Jona were good friends. Together, were spending time together as a company, as a band, Interesting to know. So there seems to be good connection. It seems to be the artists overcoming the boundaries, okay, the official boundaries dictated by state or church, okay. The third source is, once again, the life of another artist written by Baldinucci, mentioning something really interesting. The guy who is told about, Antonio Bracciolini, is not so well known. At least I don't think he's one of the major figures in the Florentine art scene. But Bracciolini is important for him because Bracciolini was producing the human being figure in Jona's landscape. Jona is said to be very good in doing nature mortis, still life, but not in reproducing human beings. So the faces, the shape, the body was something that he was commissioning to other artists. So Bracciolini, like Giusti, were doing the human figures in Jona's paintings. I don't think it is something quite unusual, okay? But both sources are saying the same things, okay? Which is really, really interesting. Now, where was Jona working at the time? Where was he operating? Thanks God we found the sources. I remember about Salomon Levi, we found the house of Jona. Jona lived like 50 years, 60 years before Salomon Levi, but, the records of the ghetto are still existing. So we found, for instance, the house of Jona. In this case, we haven't found his name. We found the name of his brother, Emanu-El Streicker. Emanu-El Streicker was living in this part of the ghetto. So what will be the end of the first ghetto, Cosimo I, and the beginning of the second section done by Cosimo III, okay, in this two-floor house, okay, together with the family. We know they were paying taxes, so we know that Emanu-El, with 4 kids and a wife, together with Uncle Jona, were living together in this house. And then we try to trace all the sparks that we found in the archive. In the Jewish Community Archive, the National Archive, in the Archbishop Archive, we found many references to people named Osilio. And then we are able to reconstruct the family tree. So we knew that Jona was the brother of Menachem, Manuel, Donato, and so on. That they were sons of someone called Flaminio, okay? So there seems to be also from a patronymic, onomastic point of view, something very Italian. So they belong to the Italian Jewish community. They're Italian, their primary names were Italian, Latin names like Flaminio. It's not something like Michael or Eliao or something like that, okay? Jona is the first Jewish name in the family. So we found many information. The tree is not complete, but imagine we did it in less than 2 months. And this is not because we are the best researchers, but because the sources are really extremely rich and untaped so far, so unstudied. I also found a trial. Once again, I checked the internal Jewish courts operating in the Ghetto, the secular court that we saw yesterday. We found a trial, a simple one, a civil case involving Jona, who wanted to rent a workshop. And I supposed to work as a painter inside the Ghetto, okay? In this case, the agreement didn't work because the owners of the so-called, not the owners, the possessors, those who have possession, not the ownership of the house, refused to fix the workshop before renting it, so everything was, left. And the judges forced the landlords to pay to Jona a fee, basically, okay? Now, Jona was member of a professional guild in Florence. And so all the historiographical vulgate about the fact that the Jews were not allowed to be part of these professional associations, banned from, a decent professional life, seems to be not true. Simply, we found that, Jona joined one of the most important art academies, l'Accademia del Disegno in Florence. We found that he paid taxes until 1695-98, that we take as a terminus ad quem. We don't know when he died, but certainly he was alive until 1698. Presumably, he died a few years after, if he was mentioned as a young man by Sagrestani. So we don't know exactly when he died. We don't know when he was born. We know where he was working. We know that he had an extraordinary life. He was in love with a Christian lady, beautiful, rich, widow, fantastic. It seems like a movie story, But then we also found information very relevant from an historical point of view about commissions. That is the point, commissions. And Sagrestani said that he was commissioned works by noble families in Florence. And this hypothesis, what he said, is confirmed by a series of texts that one of our friends and fellow researchers, Pasquale Focarile, sorry about that, suggested us to see. He studied in detail Manelli family, was an aristocrat family in Florence, and then he gave me a lot of directions. He said, Jacopo Manelli, in between 1684 and 95, bought a lot of works, even though he was going to bankruptcy and he had no money, but he insisted in buying works. And for instance, he found the documents concerning the commission of 4 landscapes to Jona. We haven't identified these 4 landscapes, but we know that it was commissioned for landscape. Plus, he was asked to decorate a clock and then to make a genealogical tree of the family, a family tree of the Manelli. So he commissioned to Jona 4 landscape plus a decoration for a clock, and then to make the family tree of his family. Interesting. So we haven't identified the clocks, but we imagine in terms of plausibility there was something like that. He was making a landscape in one of the most, beautiful clocks that they had. So this is a 17th century clock. It could have been something like that, or something like that. We don't know. We will let you know soon about the clocks, okay? That's plausibility, okay? This is a detail. It could have been something like that. So, but if you look at the genealogical tree, there seems to be quite, a good art in it. He was making the background of this family tree. We found a second copy. Unfortunately, I can't show you the photo of the second family tree because we were unable to access the archives in the storage or whatever, in one of the museums in Florence. But the other point, how was he selling his works, his paintings to, let's say, normal people? We don't know, but we have a tip, a suggestion. We found in the Jewish Community Archive, in the National Archive, that some of the paintings that the Grand Dukes were buying to people living in Florence were given, especially though the works coming from the Ghetto, through one Massaro, a leader, a political leader of the Italian Jewish community. In this case, Abramo Gallico. Abramo Gallico was a lifelong leader of the Jewish community, of Italian Jewish community in the Ghetto. Here in this document that was produced by those who were in charge of taking record of the payment, he said, we had the paintings of Jona through one of our agents called Abramo Gallico. And I checked. Abramo Gallico at the time was a political leader and a judge in the Ghetto. So is it because he was in familiar terms, good terms with the authorities that he was working as intermediary? It's a good hypothesis, it has to be proved. So now, what about works? Then we try to go deeper into the identification work. And it became very complicated. But at the same time, simple, depends what we mean. Simple in terms of theory, complicated in terms of quantity of things that we have to check. So since I'm not an art historian, and I don't have the tools to look at things critically, stylistically, or whatever, even historically, I try to study all the registers. I open all the registers stored now in the archive of Uffizi galleries, okay? With the help of people working over there, we found that the Medici were buying works, paintings, still life, landscapes from Jona, and we were then able to also identify the position of these works in the Medici buildings. We found out that most of the works were hanging at the Poggio Imperiale, okay? So they were produced, were commissioned and they're put over there. We found a room, ground floor, I don't want to go into detail, second floor, mostly in places concerning, produce kitchens or, corridors, okay, something that normal people could look at. But then, how to identify these works? Then we had to do another big survey, a long survey. It took many, many hours and many people helping us, and we identified 2 works at the Uffizi galleries, 1 work at Poggio a Caiano, 2 works over there, and many other all over Tuscany, because as you know, national belongings can be given to national offices in order to beautify the places. So we even found, but we haven't yet seen directly, we got a photo, by the way, really bad photo, done in the late 1990s, of a painting now at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Rome. You can't imagine how many times we tried to ask them to give us a photo, to let me or someone else go inside. Even the director of our, the most important artistic institution of the Uffizi tried to help us, and we will succeed, I'm sure. But for the time being, we were unable to see these work at Foreign Office Ministry. Now, as Alessio said, these are the works produced by Jona Osilio. I don't want even to dare to go into detail. I want to judge the style. I want to say anything about this production. This will be done soon in a very in our very detailed, deep study. But as you can see, we have found many, mostly still natures, still life. Okay, sorry. In good shape, depends on the shape. Is not that is quite terrible. We also found also these. I'm a bit in love with the crab. I will tell you why I'm in love with the crab. If you look at the crab, as he said, the crab is gazing at the audience, okay, somehow. And in my view, the crab is something anthropomorphic. Look at the eyes of the crab. Is it visible? It's not really visible, sorry about that. Let me see if it is better. It's not that better. Yeah, I know, sorry about that. Okay, it's not visible. We'll try to do something better right now. Just a second. We found another still live, much better. These are the Uffizi gallery. But then we also found a supposed portrait of a Jew living in the Ghetto, done by our friend Jona. Oh, this attribution, by the way, is not 100% sure. Why isn't it sure? Let me tell you very briefly why it's not, but I believe could be attributed to this friend, Jona Osilio. There is a list of 154 portraits of human beings, okay, originally staying at the Corridoio Vesaliano, the connection point between Palazzo Vecchio and Pitti Palace. And in this list of paintings, we have a lot of, description a painting, portrait of a lady done by is normally abbreviated with dis, D-I-S dot of, disegno, drawing of. In this list, we have a portrait of David Isaiah Tedesco, dis, as you can see here, dis, okay, Janostilo. Historians in the past said, we don't know who is this Janostilo, because we don't know that it existed. So this means it was disciple of. So this should be a self-portrait of someone who was a pupil, a disciple, a student of Janostilo. I don't know if it really makes sense. In my view, this means a drawing, a painting of Jona. Okay. And I dare to do a comparison. Now, don't laugh. I know, just it's an ignorant man trying to make a comparison and going to the point. In my view, the eyes of this beautiful man look like the crab. They look very much the same. And maybe, that's really maybe, a big maybe, it was Jona trying to be funny, to put his signature in something that couldn't be signed properly. Thank you.
Hi. Could I take my mask off?
Sure, yeah.
I have a few questions, but one in particular. You said that he was self-taught and that he bought paintings by Salvatorosa, who was very famous at that time, so his paintings would have been fairly costly. Mm-hmm. So one question is, how could he afford to have bought paintings by Salvatorosa and that artist in particular to copy from? And the other thing is, I'm a painter myself, and I lived in Florence, and I did a little research about the Ghetto and the Florentine Jewish community. But I'm thinking, as a painter at that time, you didn't go out and buy your paint. Mm-hmm. You had to learn how to make paint before you could be a painter. Yeah. Before you could be a self-taught artist, you had to learn how to make your materials. And that was a major part of the training of artists. So how would, as a self-taught person with no access to this knowledge, how would he have been able to do that? That seems very mysterious to me.
It seems to me, very curious to me too, because I don't know. I have no idea, to be honest. But it's a good question. I mean, my hypothesis is that the only way to bypass the ban about confraternities and guilds was to become like a musician. Instead of having a degree, you become a solo virtuoso, and then you become a star. But you don't follow the curriculum. He couldn't follow the curriculum. Then he found that the only way to be a painter was to copy other people's works. But
to copy, you need to know how to make paint. Your suggestion is
good. Yeah, it was a very costly, very expensive work. Salvatorosa at the time was I don't know. Can we say superstar or something like that?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. We don't know.
So that's,
sorry, but
yeah, that sounds very. I have my doubts that he was entirely self-taught, because that is almost impossible. It's like becoming a self-taught apothecary. I mean, of course, there were treatises that you could probably read, and there were artist treatises that he could get his hands on. Yeah. But then, the cost of the Salvatorosa paintings, and then the cost of pigments, because some pigments were very expensive. Yeah. It wouldn't be easy at that time. Now, you can just go to an art supply store and buy stuff. But at that time, it would have been very difficult to be as proficient as he seems to be.
But bear in mind that this information comes from my biography.
Yeah, sure.
A biography artist, So, do you believe everything Vasari says?
Sorry.
I mean,
just in response to that, I would say Salvatorosa also made etchings, and it was very common at the time. Many artists and artists who were famous and in the guilds, they exchanged prints, across country borders, and that was how a lot of people learned and adopted styles of certain artists. So I don't remember the exact language of the excerpts, but it's possible that he was collecting prints of these artists to learn their forms. There also, I mean, the one famous Renaissance Jewish artist that we have is Yoel Ben Shimon, who was a manuscript illuminator active in Germany and Italy. And he learned, and it wasn't, you know, he wasn't in the guilds, but he learned and made really beautiful illuminations. So there were ways, and we're not sure exactly, you know, he was learning probably at the periphery and seeing what everybody does. Access to materials, I'm sure if you had money you could do that, but it's interesting to think about how, but there must have been a way. So.
Well, there's another Jewish artist from the 1520s, 30s, Moise di Castellazzo, di Castellazzo, and he probably never had a teacher if you look at his pictures, you know, and that's the other you know, sort of known Jewish artist that has been studied and sometimes elevated to positions he shouldn't be in, so to speak, in the hierarchy of artistic production.
Historically is important, but...
Historically is important, artistically is a disaster.
I have a simple question that could be, well, can a Jewish artist be apprenticed to a Christian artist?
Could it be?
Well, we've seen what is happening with what happened with Jona. There are certain urban legends or commonplaces about Jews in Florence that, you know, that they couldn't be members of the academy, and, you know, and also remember yesterday we spoke at length of how Jewish women, Jews and Christians couldn't have relations, let alone sexual relations. I mean, that was actually enforced by Cosimo III, right? And yet he did, you know, and he did enter the Accademia del Disegno, you know. So, I mean, we have to work in that gray area. The question whether they could, you know, whether they could be, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I can't think of anyone right now on top of my head, you know. But the archives, you know, make you understand, make you see a reality which is sometimes deviates from the common path, and this is exactly why we work with primary sources, because, you know, a lot of the assumptions that we had about, you know, Jews and Jews producing art, right, were somehow completely debunked by Jona, right? Now, it could be, you know, one of the situations, and we have one in an earlier period with Cosimo I. When Cosimo I had his merchant Piergabriele, there was a special relationship, you know, and maybe he could get away with a lot of things. The Abravanel family could get away with a lot of things. So you have to imagine that there is, you know, there's not a sense of homogeneity in the bans or in the restrictions. Jona is an example, you know, and the thing about Jona is that, you know, we only discovered this, or Gabriele only discovered this 4 months ago. So we really don't know if there are other artists, you know, like him, other Jewish artists of various kinds. So this is exactly what, you know, why research is so important, you know, why looking at archives is so important, especially because you completely change the course of a historical assumption.
And I would say also that it's important to work in a team, because normally scholars are like, you know, it should be monks working alone in focusing on a specific topic, and they don't work with a team and with other disciplines. In our case, we are different people working on different things, but, you know, gathering together at a certain point. So we have the Humanities, the Jewish studies, the medicine people. That is what makes us able to get, you know, to find these things. You know, otherwise I wouldn't be able to. It would be for me as a philologer originally was, okay, Jona would be still a name and a surname, maximum, no more than that.
I think it's fascinating, and I agree that it would probably be difficult, but there were women like Sofonisa Anguissola that certainly she wasn't allowed to go into the men's, and all her sisters weren't, and they were all painters, plus the fact that she did use the crab.
Thank you.
But that goes back to the archive. We had assumptions about women artists like Artemisia, that were completely changed once scholars went in the archive and understood that, it wasn't like that anymore. And I can tell you, lists of things that we thought women couldn't do, and in fact, women artists could do.
Yeah. So you said he really started apparently to be an artist at the age of 36?
Yeah.
Is there any information about him before that, what he did? Because that's a pretty advanced age for that period.
I know. There is no, I haven't found any information about his previous life. Nothing, yes. The Osilio family seems to be a very minor family in the ghetto. They had no property, no things. Maybe they had, I don't know what they were doing, basically, yeah.
Among the visual artists, were there any noted artists who were doing and working on illustrated manuscripts at that time, making tapestries, or taking various biblical stories and illustrating them? Was there anything like that during this period done by the Jews in the ghetto? Have you come across anyone?
Well, he mentioned Moise da Castellazzo, who was, making simple things, I couldn't say he was a really artist. Oh, yeah. Well, as you know, I'm not an art expert, historian, but what I can tell you is why we were working on the exhibition on the Jews and the Medici. We found out that before the Ghetto, I'm not answering your question by passing, but we found that before the Ghetto, when the Jews were living all over Tuscany, integrated into the social fabric and become, they had moneylenders and also professional things and doctors and scientists, they were commissioning decoration to Christians, in miniatures and whatever, illuminations of their own prayer books or Bibles and Agadot. And we found the most important illumination produced in Tuscany before the Ghetto. So there seems to be a great connection between the owner of the manuscript, the parchment, and then the illuminators, Christian illuminators. As far as I can tell you, this is the process. At the time, it was customary to have someone illuminating your work as a Jew, but you are the owner of the text, and someone is illuminating. But as far as I can tell you, I don't know Jewish illuminators. There might be, but it's not my field.
Were there also any Jewish jewelry makers or the makers of menorahs and things like that?
I don't know, but we know for sure that in the Guardaroba Medici, one of the archival collections that are in the National Archive, many artisans, Jewish artisans, are mentioned.
So that is the inventory of the Medici possessions. The Guardaroba is the large inventory of Medici, anything from works of art to a pillow, so everything is listed. So, and they're pretty thorough.
Yeah.
What was that manuscript that you said you found the most important manuscript?
It's a 21 manuscript. I don't remember the name, but they are all over the world, from Moscow to London, Bodleian Library, British Library, and they have been studied individually as a single work, but not as in a context of the pre-Ghetto manuscript production. So we are still working on these because I think that all these manuscripts, they are different, but there are common things that they are very precious and produced for the Jews living in their own houses in a assimilated environment. They have a common fil rouge. They are produced by Christians for the Jews, and they are very precious, very valuable items. They wouldn't be produced later with the making of the Ghetto, not because the Jews became poor, maybe, but because this connection, this sort of process connecting one and the other was no longer allowed. So I can give you the details of all these manuscripts, but it's a lot of materials produced in between the early 15th century until the late 16th century with the coming of the Ghetto, yes. What's the last question?
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
What I suggest you do is you should definitely look at all of our initiatives, not just Jewish related, because we have many. The obvious thing is to go on www.medici.org, which lists really the entirety of all of our scholarly production, our educational production, and also our publications. And also, we have, which we're sort of very proud of, we don't do much, a lot of social media, but we focus on one, which is Instagram, which is basically, the idea of putting documents in a very digestible, easy, and fun way, for everyone. And these are original, unpublished documents that sort of depict and deconstruct the life of the Medici, or actually of the 16th, 17th, 18th century, in ways which is attractive. But if, and this I'm speaking to the thousands of people online, which is sort of weird because there are only a few of you. The idea is that, you should definitely contact us. That's our website, and see how, again, the importance of working with primary sources, with factual truths, not truths, factual truths, is something that, as I said, and as Gabriele showed, and as we hope have shown to you in the past 3 days, something that can completely change, the course of history, and doubt the way we think of things, we understand things, and we're used to thinking of things. And this is exactly what we really are all about, in a nutshell. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.